Good morning, everybody. Am I on?
Careful, bring it up. Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. I'm on. While they're trying to, while they're trying to figure that out, I have figured it out. Let me talk to you a little bit about where we're at this morning, or what hopefully we've accomplished. The first time we really talked, I tried to provide actually some exegetical basis for why we should take the Sermon on the Mount in a certain way. In particular, we wanted to look at the Beatitudes and sort of see how the Beatitudes are nested in a context that suggests that God is all about transforming our lives, and we can talk about that by talking about our stories. The fact is that loss and inadequacy and grief will characterize large portions. That's not me, is it? It is me? What are y'all doing? What are y'all doing to me? You're making me sound like a bumblebee. Darth Vader. That's right. This is what you need to hear this Sunday morning is from Darth Vader.
Not real merciful.
No, it's not. Huh? What did you need? Would you need the... Okay, I'm good. All right. All of our lives contain certain issues. In order for the Lord to redeem, He has to work with our understanding of those events. He has to really change the way that we see them, the good, the bad, the everything. And then we spent some time actually talking about those 8 points, that transformation from going from being just merely broken to transformed and actually representative of God in the world. Then this morning, I hopefully wanted to talk to you a little bit about, interestingly enough, community and how important it is the process of understanding not just yourself, but how you interact with the rest of the world. I believe and have come to discover that isolation, strong individualism for the Christian is a kind of suicide. In any context that I've ever been in, isolation has only led to darkness, and darkness has only led really to the disadvantage of my own sin nature essentially kind of dominating me. It's not that the Lord wasn't there and that good things weren't possible, but I have found that there are certain things about myself that I will not understand. There are certain things that the Holy Spirit will only provide in community. Now, that's really different for me because I grew up being a very strong individualist, and probably explains why I have sought on various occasions to be a more spiritual person, a more godly person, but those efforts have largely been reflected in individual efforts, being very studious of the Scriptures. Pharisees and scribes were once charged by Jesus, you search the Scripture, for in them you think you have, what? Life. Scriptures are a good thing. They're God's holy word. But life is found in Christ. And Christ has expressed Himself not just in the Word, but in His body, in the people that He's provided. I remember the first time that this really began to become a major issue was my first time overseas. I studied in Spain. I'm a modern language major, believe it or not. And we studied on the Aggie A&M campus in Santiago de Compostela in northeastern Spain. And I was there for a whole summer. Great place. But I was alone. And as a believer, I was with a group of people from A&M whose main interest was not to study Spanish any longer, but to party. And I can remember getting there, and I had already encountered my quest for mysticism. I was seeking Jesus somehow to show up in my prayer closet, and I'm not saying he doesn't. I learned lots of good things from my mystical phase in life. And I'd studied the Kesses, and I'd studied anything that I felt like would give me an upper hand on my sin nature. And but the isolation of it wasn't going too well, and so I can remember the evangelical population in Spain is very small. And I can remember searching out the brethren. I knew that the brethren were here somewhere. It's kind of ironic. The brethren are around here somewhere. And so I went to their church, and I just walked through the front door, and I met a man who was at that time, I think he was probably 98 years ago. You have to understand, I'm sure he's gone on to be the Lord, gone on to be with the Lord, because this is 30 some odd years ago. And Pablo took me under his wing and showed me places in Santiago that I would have never known without him. He really taught me the value of tapas. And going in and getting a small glass of wine and sitting around this tortilla de España, and him asking me questions like, explícame, por favor. Why do some of you Americans think it's a sin to drink? It was just a nice debate. I don't know what it is, but I felt immediately strengthened by Pablo's company. And we were an odd Mutt and Jeff combination walking the streets, because he had the classic black vest. I don't know if you've seen these guys, but and then just dressed up and had the little black hat that they all wear, and was walking around with a cane, and was talking to everybody he knew about Jesus. And there I was in my shorts, and I can't even tell you what they called them, but they were these rubber sandals with a obscene picture in the sole of them. Wendy probably knows what I'm talking about. I'll tell you outside of the context of this sacred place. But I was wearing that and t-shirts, and there we were walking around, and I felt immediately strengthened. And he invited me to his church, and I found fellowship. I think Christians are a little bit like slivers of steel. I don't know if you've ever done this in science. You take slivers of steel and you pour them on a piece of paper, and then you put a magnet underneath it, and immediately the slivers line up in this pattern of magnetic force. And in a very real way, wherever Christians go, they tend to try to find other Christians. Why? Because they sort of instinctively know that if they don't, they're going to be in peril. Now, from a recovery point of view, the men that I have tried to help have become sick. Not just because they are sinners, because as we've looked at in the Sermon on the Mount, everybody's got that problem, right? The thing that has made them sick is their silence and their isolation. Whatever is not put into the light, and put into the light, not just, sometimes I think we play games in confessing our sins to the Lord, 1 John 1:9, which provides cleansing and access to the Father, and it's very important, but there's this whole other area that it can be quite convenient for your pride to leave out, and that's confessing your sins to one another so that they can pray for you and you can find healing. And that body life component, part of the community, is actually very, very critical for any person becoming a healthy Christian. It's a group project. The life of Christ I noticed that Drew has already named the series that I didn't give it a series, Living the Life of Christ. Is that right? Yeah, something like that. I don't know. That's cool. He's actually doing production stuff over here that I didn't do for the series. A lot of it is his take on things, which is really cool. But here's the deal. This life of Christ, this picture of Jesus in the Beatitudes, this experiencing the life of Jesus is a group project. Now, I really don't have any cool illustration to say this, other than what I just told you about my own instincts, but there is a growing sense of conclusion that I will never be all that God has intended me to be until I am not afraid of her and can share and be totally naked and unashamed with my wife. And in a broader context, be connected, lined up with the magnetic field that Jesus creates for believers, in which I am aligned with other believers in a way that they can help me bear the burden of my own sin nature. There will be parts of my story, even if I know the outline of the Beatitudes, and I take it away and I read Jesus' sermon and I see his exposition for all of these things, I go, yeah. There'll be a certain limitation to my own understanding of that until I take the same story and dump it out in front of other believers and have them look at it and help me interpret what God is doing in my life. In other words, if my eyes are the only ones that ever look at my story, there's going to be a big limitation to how much insight I have into it and how much healing I experience for the pain and how much strength that I have in order to do what God wants me to do. Is that kind of clear how important community is? Men to recover need two things. They need understanding of their story, and they need a safe place to unpack their story and to have loving, gentle, understanding eyes put on their stuff. Not condoning sin, not being sin-friendly, but being very sinner-loving. You following me? Without that, sick men don't get better. Christian people don't grow. And so I've been to a conference here recently in which we were examining a recovery program. And I just want to share with you a little bit about what I learned before we get into today's passage. Maybe when I get done, Drew, that might be a good time to take a break before we come back to the actual exposition. But we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 7, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 12. But before we get there, here's what I ran into. I ran into, and I've always thought myself to be a pretty gracious guy. But when I began to hear the stories of what comes through the front door, if you're following me, of this particular church that did this conference, I was challenged with my own prejudices about what I feel comfortable coming through the front door. For whatever reason, even though I have come from a part of the United States that is known for its bigotry, it never really caught to me. I don't really sense in myself any kind of reservations based on race or ethnicity or any of that. But there are certain kinds of problems that for one reason or another, I have concluded there's no hope. Having worked with MHMR, and this is my conclusion, y'all stay with me. God's not going to leave me here. I'm just sharing with you my own bigotry, which is a good thing to be aware of. And my bigotry, some of it came from the mental health field. While I was going to seminary, I worked for mental health, mental retardation in the United States and Texas. And I worked in a psychiatric hospital, Timberline Psychiatric Hospital in Dallas, Texas. And It was one of the premier teaching psychiatric hospitals. And they would do testing, and I began to come up with categories of people you could help and people you couldn't. There is this thing in certain people when it tests out. It's called sociopathic sociopathy, and these individuals, a lot of times, even some of them were born, and they seem to be missing a few marbles. If you understand the metaphor, it means there's something wrong because their mothers were addicted to methamphetamine, and there is a developmental problem in the actual brain of the children, and they're born, and they don't seem to have any kind of conscience whatsoever. Statistically, these people, and we looked at it, statistically, those people either wind up incarcerated for their entire lives or dead. And there's very few of them that ever step out of that to live any kind of meaningful life with other people. They're dangerous. There are other categories of people whose problems are such that actually I've had to admit that I'm a little bit ashamed of the gospel. You know, Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for I know that it's what? It's the power of God for salvation to those who believe. If I can get in there and get them to believe the gospel, there is going to be hope for salvation and deliverance from what? I don't see any limitation in Paul's explanation and in his defense of the gospel. There is nothing off the table, including people who test out sociopathic in their testing. Well, here I am at this conference, and a guy gets up, and I should have known this was going to be a great testimony because the dude's nose was over here on the side of his face. It had been moved somehow. And he came up and he started to talk about how he had tested out as a sociopath. And that he was one of these guys who absolutely loved to fight. That's what he loves to do, is go pick fights, even in his own family. In order to tell the story, he told about the horrific incident of him going to meet his own flesh and blood brother in order to beat him up because of a little squabble. And as he was actually beating up his brother, he looks over and sees his niece in the car watching it all. Sociopath would not feel any remorse, not any guilt. But he became aware of the fact that he was going to die, that there was something terribly broken about him. He actually looked inside of himself and saw an inability and heard what people had said about him, that it wasn't possible. And he became, first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit who are aware of their inability to help themselves. And he began to look for help. And then he walked through the front door. They have this phrase, who do you feel comfortable walking through your front door? Now, the people who walk through the front door, here's the deal. We can't change the laws and spiritual laws that the wages of sin is what? It's death. And there are certain consequences that some of these people have wrapped up in their life that we're not going to be able to change. However, we can offer anybody hope if the gospel is what Paul says it is in Romans, that it brings deliverance to anybody who believes it. And are we the safe place where they will actually be able to talk about a story where they willingly went and beat up their own brother in front of their brother's son or daughter? Will they be able to put that out on the table and you not, by one form or another, indicate to them, no, there's no hope for you. And quite frankly, we don't want you to be here. Now, I have more tolerance for that, but my bigotry was further challenged, and they actually videotaped this one of a man who had been convicted of incest. He had served his time in prison, and in prison had come to know the Lord. And come out of prison, and of course, there are certain what? The wages of sin is death. His wife was probably correct in divorcing him. In my opinion. Probably correct in divorcing him because of what was going on. Probably correct in removing the children, and good for her that she prosecuted it, reported it, got her kids out of that dangerous position, and so on. But this guy actually wanted help. Where did he go? He tried a lot of stuff, but he began to really seriously try Christ and began to come to a recovery program in which he could take all of the garbage that lurked in his heart and put it on the table with some safe people and begin to process his story. He began to recover. Now, as I heard that story, you know what I'm thinking about? Now, you guys are from Cleveland Bible Church, and y'all know that we are a church whose mantra is, we're a place where grace makes a difference. In other words, we've challenged our community and ourselves that there's nothing that can walk through our door that we won't believe that God can't change and help by His grace. That's our mantra. I'm the associate pastor there, and if those guys come through my front door that I've just explained, I'm kind of going, can God really? Or do we really want them to go away? Now, I want to say something very carefully. I am an executive pastor. A guy that came through the front door that I knew that story, he had better come and tell it to me. He better come and report himself as a registered sex offender. They're RSOs. That's what they're called. You can find them online in the United States. They have to be there. And if they come and tell us, we've decided that they can come and listen, but they can't even go down to the children's area, right? They have to report in. There are certain consequences that this dude told us about that he's willing to live with for the rest of his life. He understands that those are the consequences of what he's done, and he's not going to try to get out from under them. He's going to accept them as God's will for his life from this point on. But if that guy comes through the door, you can see it in faces. Ooh, maybe I'm starting to touch some of your buttons about what's possible. The truth of the matter is that men, I know, will not get better unless they understand their story and how they're responding to it, and unless they have a safe place called community that they can go to. Now, can we take a break now? Because, if we're going to take a break and then come back together, that might be a good place to leave it. Here's the questions I want to leave with you to think about a little bit, sort of digest for 10 minutes while you take a break. If you are not ever really going to make the end of your journey without other people, the question then becomes, what kind of people are you looking for, and where are you going to find them? Okay? Where are you going to find them? And I think the question is particularly, I haven't had too much of a chance. I appreciate the way some of you have shared pieces of your stories, vulnerable pieces of your stories to me. This hasn't just been a matter of teaching, but it's also been a matter of discovering that everybody, this stuff really is true. We all have our stories. We all have our stuff. All these things that we've had to learn. And learn how to walk with Christ through it. And then actually turn it around and then use it to help other people. It's actually an amazing thing. But the challenge of the passage that we will look like, and I want to put this together for you. Jesus gets done with his exposition of those 8 Beatitudes at the end of chapter 6. And then in chapter 7, he begins to talk about the application of those things. Now listen to me carefully. The very first miracle that is recorded after we leave the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount takes place where? On a mountain. What's the exegetical metaphor telling us that this is God's or heavenly perspective on the multitudes, right? Then when we come down from the mountain, what are we entering into in chapter 8? We're immediately transitioning into real world situations. I want you to understand that Matthew sees fit for the first miracle that he tells you about after the Sermon on the Mount to be the approach of a leper. Now, it's very, very hard for us to understand how people at that time viewed leprosy, because we have a medical model in the back of our head that we've developed in the West that says, oh, that's caused by bacteria, with something in Latin, and it's this, and it's caused by that, and that's what it is. And we immediately sort of sanitize it and clean it up a little bit and make it a little bit more digestible for ourselves, a little bit more approachable. We don't see it associated with sin. The people of that time associated it with God's curse on people. And they weren't allowed to live in community with other people. I want you to see that. They were expected, like those who struggle with same-sex attraction, or those who struggle with worse problems sexually, or those who test out sociopath. We push them away from society because they're dangerous. And again, I want to caveat all of this. Let's don't go stupid. Let's don't go stupid into the night about what precautions may need to be made around these folks. But you need to understand that all of the categories of people that I just talked about, they are perfectly represented in the metaphor of a leper. First guy that is encountered. And I believe that Jesus was a great teacher, and who wouldn't be a great teacher who couldn't actualize parables in order to make the point that he had just spoken about? And so he actualizes a parable in such a way. An actualized parable is a parable that actually takes place in an event. You following me? And so everything that he's talking about actually shows up in front of the disciples, and they immediately get to see how this is supposed to be applied as this leper. Whoa! We got to go around this guy. And this guy immediately, if we look at it, you can look at it later, he actually comes and he goes low. Sound familiar? Goes low. He is meek. He prostrates. The text literally says he worships, which is nothing more than the word that he falls down and puts himself below Jesus. And he asks them, if you're willing, you can what? You can make me whole. Now, here's what's important, guys. Jesus could have kept his distance. He didn't have to do this other than to make a point. He could have spoken the word, and what? He's healed. It's not what Jesus does. To the shock and the horror and the dismay of all of his disciples who just listened to a great sermon, he touches the guy. The text clearly, unequivocally, deliberately points out that Jesus touches the guy first and says, I'm willing. And then he says, be cleansed. Jesus makes the point that to be effective, we have to be in contact with some of the grossest, scariest things and believe that there is nobody, there is nothing that Jesus Christ cannot deliver people from. One more quick illustration. The guy who discipled me, he was the teacher that I wanted to be. His name is Dwight Edwards. He's actually a descendant of Jonathan Edwards. And he was teaching at Texas A&M at Grace Bible Church, and he was becoming famous. I don't know that that was his intent, but he was becoming famous, writing books, being asked to go speak here, there, yonder. Probably even got a gig in New Zealand. But one day, it seems like one day, but there must have been some sort of something going on inside of him. He walks away from everything I'd ever admired about him. Walks away from his family. Some of us, I've later wondered how painful it must have been to be in a family where his 3 boys, 2 of them had an incurable genetic anomaly that was causing them to move gradually and inevitably towards a complete paralysis. They would someday be in wheelchairs, 2 of his 3. And the doctor revealed to him, says, you know, this is just one of those things that's loaded. You 2 people should have never gotten married. It was inevitable that this was going to happen. And he lived with that pain and all of that. But one day, inexcusably, he walks away, commits adultery, is willing to run away from everything I'd admired about him. And for several years, I mean, God was teaching me, well, who are you following anyway, buddy? You following men that you admired and you wanted what they wanted to have? Is that not any different from covenant? Or were you following me? And so I went through that, went through some depression over it, but here's the thing. I found myself going to places where, you know, it's just real easy in Christian circles, especially the broader ones, to play pile on. You know, oh, well, you know, I knew there must have been a problem. I saw that one coming because, you know, whatever. And I began to realize that I felt defensive for my old mentor, not because he didn't do something wrong, but because I loved him, and I had to believe that there was hope for him to turn it around and be restored. I had to believe that. You know why? Because if there's not hope for him, there wasn't going to be hope for me. And I think getting into our stories and being able to see how dark the darkness is and be able to show others will help us develop a healthy sense of hope and tolerance for the darkness that's in others. The passage that we will look at some of those skills. Who is going to be that community? Who are going to be those people who have a very broad, wide front door? Not that they're stupid about sin. Y'all hear me saying loud and clear, we're not stupid about sin and its consequences and what we may have to do in order to protect ourselves. But we don't ever look at people. We can't afford to look at people and say, there's hope for me, but not you. Can't do that. God won't let you. So let's take a break right at 10 o'clock. And then we'll be back when? 10 minutes. 10 minutes.